Jnanatirmirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurumilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeyam Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamstra Shri Rupam Sagajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Paridana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Pada Sagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitam Shahi Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Buddhagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namustate Tapta Kanta Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Krishna Banasate Devi Pranamami Hari Priya Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhavacha Patidanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirshesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So welcome to, we're beginning now chapter 14 of this Bhagavad Gita study. So we saw in the last chapter how the Kshetragya is trapped within the Kshetra in Prakriti due to association with nature, with Prakriti, and specifically the modes of material nature. And we are stuck here trying to be the Purusha, the enjoyer. In verse 13:22, the 22nd verse of that last chapter serves as the foundation for the rest of this. And in that verse it says, the living entity in material nature thus follows the way of life, enjoying the three modes of nature. So there's three modes of nature. Now Krishna is going to explain in this verse. And though the Kshetragya is distinct from nature and from the Kshetra, the field, it is trapped within it. It is trapped by these three very powerful chains or shackles, and they're the three modes of nature. And the living entity becomes controlled and limited by these three modes into so many different ways. And you know, how is the soul trapped or shackled? Well, the living entity performs so many different activities, and from those activities generate reactions. And those reactions generate more and more bodies. And like this continues: birth, death, old age, disease, and it just cycles through. The cycle keeps us trapped in the three modes of nature, condition the living entity. So in this chapter, we're going to learn and see how the modes of nature act to bind us within the Kshetra, here within the realm of Prakriti, the nature. And we'll see how actually they can, by understanding the three modes though, they give liberation. Because one can understand how to become free from these shackles. So we study these modes for the important point of bringing ourselves, to the point of the mode of goodness. And from the mode of goodness, one can then transcend, get beyond the modes. So we're going to talk about transcending the modes in this chapter. And what that means is getting beyond the influence of these three modes of material nature. Because they all are shackles, as we see. They all will bind us here. But the best place to come to is the mode of goodness, and from the mode of goodness one can go beyond. One cannot launch, just like the runway is the place to reach before the plane can take off. Similarly, to be able to transcend the modes, one must come to the mode of goodness. So we'll be able to see by this chapter what modes are predominant within us by observing our different activities. How we sleep, the music we listen to, the foods we eat, etc. Will help guide us, because all of those activities are within one of the three modes: goodness, passion, or ignorance. And so we'll be discussing those in the coming week or two. This week we'll be discussing primarily understanding each of the three modes in a little bit of detail and what they are. Right? So in the first verse, Krishna opens up this chapter by saying, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, again, I shall declare to you this supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge, knowing which all the sages have attained the supreme perfection. Right? So this chapter, is interesting because Krishna says supreme wisdom. So what is the supreme wisdom all about? We thought chapter 9 was, the highest knowledge, right? Manmano Bhavabhavakto, this, essence of the Bhagavad Gita. In the earlier part of that chapter, we saw Raja Vidya, the king of knowledge. So how Krishna is calling this supreme, our acharyas comment that this knowledge, this is the best of knowledge about the jiva and prakriti. So he's spoken already a little bit about jiva and prakriti in the last chapter, and now he is giving additional knowledge. So when Krishna says the best of this knowledge, this is referring to knowledge about the jiva and prakriti, right? And this is not about pure devotional service. Now, this knowledge, what is the benefit of it? As Krishna says, the great sages have attained supreme perfection. So by knowing about these three modes of material nature, one can begin to find a way to escape the stringent laws of the material nature. And just like if you're locked within a prison house, if you had knowledge of how to get out, you would consider it very valuable, right? So this knowledge is going to show us how to escape the stringent laws of material nature, how to become free from the modes. And that is a great opportunity. Now, Srila Prabhupada talks about, interestingly, in the fourth line of the purport, he says, if one understands this chapter through the process of philosophical speculation, and so what is this philosophical speculation? We often talk disparagingly about speculation. And so it's an important point that there's a difference between mental speculation and philosophical speculation. Mental speculation is, let me just come up with my own ideas and try to figure this out based on my own, sort of understanding. But this philosophical speculation, it means to hear about this from a bona fide source and then try to understand it with one's intelligence, to process it, to take that knowledge that is coming from a bona fide source and trying to understand it. So there's a lecture some notes from a conversation Prabhupada was having in Bombay on January 21st, 1972, and I just wanted to read it. He says that as for the difference between mental speculation and philosophical speculation, we take it that everything is known by the psychological action of the mind. So that philosophical speculation is the same as mental speculation if it is merely the random or haphazard activity of the brain to understand everything and making theories, ifs and maybes. But if philosophical speculation is directed by Shastra and Guru, and if the goal of such philosophical attempts is to achieve Vishnu, then such philosophical speculation is not mental speculation. So the point here is, in coming up with our own ideas, that means nothing. It's when one has the knowledge of it coming from Shastra and then trying to understand it. So just an important point for us to distinguish as we see Prabhupada talking about this, philosophical speculation. Now, in the second verse, Krishna says, by becoming fixed in this knowledge, one can attain to the transcendental nature like my own. Thus established, one is not born at that time of creation or disturbed at the time of dissolution. So, what is the cycle Krishna is trying to get us out of? Again, birth and death. Right? So by being fixed in this knowledge, one can achieve the transcendental nature. So this is the great position. Because without this knowledge, one will continue to live in the cycle of karma, action and reaction. But one can stop that cycle with this knowledge. And when we say transcendental knowledge, we are referring to here any knowledge that is not contaminated by the modes of material nature. So generally, all knowledge we get is full of the modes. How to eat nicely, sleep nicely, mate nicely, and defend nicely. Right? All the universities, all our academic institutes, all the knowledge on Google, not all, but most of it, it's all based on how to enjoy the kshetra more elaborately, the body. So that is all within the modes. This knowledge is how to transcend, to get beyond. And how does this help us? Well, we understand how the material nature is binding us, right? How the kshetragya, the jiva, is trapped within the body. If we don't know, then we won't know how to get out. So when we learn to work for the other kshetragya, the super soul, instead of trying to enjoy the kshetra, the field, we can get freedom from all the reactions of the material nature and thus become liberated. So again, this knowing the jiva, prakriti, and super soul, the three aspects of Brahman, it leads to devotional service, because that is the conclusion. Either I'm going to serve nature or I'm going to serve Krishna. I have to serve one or the other. So with knowledge of how I become bound when I serve the material nature, helps me understand, well, maybe I should go to a higher platform. Okay? So this is what leads to this ultimate liberation, and no birth and no death. And when we understand these modes, we're going to start to figure out, well, how do I get it out of it? Right? We try to untie ourselves from these very strong binds, because we realize it is just creating difficulty for us. And that's how we search out a place where the modes don't exist. When we see how the mode of goodness even is binding and limits our ability to truly enjoy, then we try to find a place where there is no modes that leads us to the spiritual sky, the spiritual world, and one inquires how to get there through devotional service. And then one begins to practice devotional service. So this is how this knowledge brings one to the highest platform of life. 14.3. The total material substance called Brahman is the source of birth, and that it is that Brahman that I impregnate, making possible the births of living beings, O son of Bharata. So here Krishna is now explaining the connection between the material nature, the jiva, and the supersoul. As we talked about, the three aspects create all the perfect knowledge we discussed last time in the last chapter. Now Krishna is saying, what is the connection between these three? Right? So how does birth take place? It is impregnated by the glance of Krishna. Prabhupada gives the example of the scorpion born in a bag of rice. Okay? The rice is not the cause of the birth of the scorpion. It is the substrate. The mother scorpion has laid its eggs in that rice, and thus the scorpion is born. So the living entity, we are not born of material nature. Matter is not the cause. We may see male and female of any species coming together and producing a child, an offspring. But that is not born out of material nature. That living entity must come from Mahavishnu. That matter must be impregnated by the Supreme Lord. Scientists will try for the rest of their eternity trying to create life, but it'll never happen. Because life is coming from the Supreme Lord. This total material substance, all the matter, remember, it is dead, it is inanimate, until it's mixed with the presence of the living entity, the superior energy of Krishna. And Krishna here says that I impregnate it, making possible the births of all living entities. Right? So the material substance alone is not sufficient to create the world we see. It is not just chemical reactions and matter. That will not result in life forms. That's what the scientists are trying to do. Manipulate different things, but it won't happen. It takes the impregnation of the Supreme Lord in order for this to happen. And we see this just, in the example of a woman giving birth. The birth of the child is fully supported by all the facilities of the mother in the womb. The baby is nourished and growing through the body. But it still requires some impregnation. Otherwise, there is no birth. So similarly, though the living entities, the bodies are coming out from material nature, without the presence of this feature of the Supreme Lord, it doesn't happen. So we can understand that everything in this world is taking place due to the combination of the kshetra, the field, and the kshetragya. the soul and super soul. Right? So all of this is made possible ultimately under the direction of Krishna. So now this, the three aspects, how they're all interrelated, Krishna is making very clear. Now this topic Brahman we've discussed a few times. Remember, it refers to the jiva. It refers to the super soul, Parabrahman. And it also refers to the total material substance. So it refers to several things. We must, through Shastra, understand the distinctions between the different aspects of Brahman. And the final point, how does Krishna impregnate? Simply by the glance of his eyes. He supplies all the material nature with the living entities so that there can be this material world that we see around us. He provides all of the matter, and with his vision, impregnates all the living entities within matter, and thus we see the different life forms and interactions around us that we observe day to day. But this is how it is all interconnected. Now Krishna will continue this further. It should be understood that all species of life, O son of Kunti, are made possible by birth in this material nature, and that I am the seed-giving Father. Again, who is the source of all life? It is Krishna. He is the seed-giving Father. He is our supreme Father. Yes, we may have an intermediate father or mother, but Krishna is the supreme Father. Different kinds of births we see. There are 4 types: from perspiration, from egg, from wounds, and seeds. But ultimately it's coming from Krishna. And how are we placed in various situations, into various bodies? Simply based on our past karma. It is not random that we are impregnated or placed into different bodies. It is based on our past interaction with the modes of material nature and the resulting karma. Okay? So now let's get into the modes and see how the soul comes under control of the 3 modes, how they shackle us to this material world. 5. Material nature consists of 3 modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. When the eternal living entity comes in contact with nature, O mighty Arjuna, he becomes conditioned by these modes. So the 3 modes we have are Sattva, Raja, and Tamo. Sattva doing his mode of goodness, Raja doing his mode of passion, and Tamogun is mode of ignorance. So we'll be discussing these 3 modes. And when the jiva comes in contact with the modes, he becomes conditioned by the 3 modes. So what does it mean, conditioned? Conditioned means one becomes trapped by the 3 modes, shackled. Think of chains, locked down. Prabhupada says, acting under the spell of the 3 modes of material nature. So we become shackled by these 3 modes. So that's when we say conditioned. How does it bind us, right, to this world? So despite how much we try to be independent, we should understand we're very tightly controlled by these 3 modes of material nature. We've misused our minute independence, and that is the cause of our conditioning. The misuse of our minute independence. That is how we become conditioned. And so we are responsible for being shackled to the 3 modes. And when we say that, we think, oh, it's unfair, I'm bound and I can't get out. Well, remember, it is due to our desires alone. Our desire to be Purusha, independent of Krishna, to be this enjoyer. That is what has led to our becoming shackled. So this conditioning is not forced upon us. It is our choice, ultimately. Just as a prisoner, Prabhupada would say, is not, the judge is not responsible for the imprisonment of a prisoner. It is the actions of the prisoner that is the cause. So similarly, we are not forced by nature into different circumstances. Based on our actions, the reactions are forced upon us. So again, due to the misuse of our minute independence, we have become conditioned by these modes of material nature. And by the good use of our minute independence, we can become free from them as well. As Krishna said in the 1st and 2nd verse, just take to this knowledge fixed, and it'll happen. So what does guna mean? When we say guna, the 3 gunas. Guna means rope or qualities. So when we're exploring and exploiting the different types of matter, we acquire certain qualities. Sometimes good qualities. sometimes very passionate, strong, want qualities, and sometimes qualities in ignorance. Right? So each of us, we become controlled by certain modes. And there's a predominant mode that is present within all of us. But we have tinges of all three. It's like the three primary colors are mixed to create so many different varieties of color. You add more of one or less of the other, different shades are created. So we are all our own shade of conditioning. But there's one mode that is typically prominent within us, but we are not purely in that mode. Right? And this mode then leads to certain attractions, qualities, and tastes, based on our mode. Just like two people sitting in a restaurant. One is smoking and in bliss, and the other is coughing and eyes are burning. Well, two people can have the different experience? Well, it is based simply on the modes of material nature. One is in the mode of ignorance, and one is in the mode of goodness. So we can observe these modes, but they create certain attractions, things that we enjoy. Two friends, one works 80 hours a week and is constantly trying to get more and more money, and the other is thinking, wow, this is crazy. I'm not even enjoying life. So that's passion versus goodness. So we can observe the modes within ourselves by, again, these actions, the things that we enjoy, the qualities that we have acquired. So this ropes, the gunas, they bind us, becoming, like they braid. The three modes very intimately, very strongly, intricately tie us to this material nature. And so, in the purport, we see a little bit about the position and role of the false ego in these modes of nature. So when we come to the material world, we assume a false identity. I am this body. I am the Kshetra. And that false ego is the first covering given to us by the material nature. It is part of the material body, the subtle material body, but it is part of the material body. So that false ego, based on that, the rest of the body manifests, both the subtle and the gross. So the false ego covers the soul and is then the junction between our spiritual identity and the material existence. It is what sits in between our real consciousness and our material identification. That is the false ego. So based on the depth of that false ego, we get different types of bodies. But that serves, remember, the false ego blocks our understanding of our real identity. Just as if you have a light bulb and you put a thick cloth over it, that cloth blocks the light from shining through. So that false ego is what covers the original consciousness of the living entity. And so, because remember, we saw last week, in the last chapter, the soul is always pure. It's never touched by the material nature, right? Like the air pockets within the mud. It is always pure. So what is the experience? It is the false ego that covers the soul, and thus we identify with the modes, and we become bound by them, and the living entity becomes trapped within the three bodies. Right? So now let us explore each of the modes in a little bit more detail. Krishna will explain each of the three in the next 3 verses, and then summarize. O sinless one, the mode of goodness, being purer than the others, is illuminating and is free, and it frees one from all sinful reactions. Those situated in that mode can become conditioned by the sense of happiness and knowledge. So again, when we say conditioned, it means it's binding us. So how does a material mode of goodness bind us? We see it's purer than the others. So it seems like that's the best. Yes, it is the best of the 3 modes, but it is still binding to this material world. It still keeps one in the material world. How? Let us explore. So here, attachment occurs to the knowledge and happiness. So there is relative happiness in this mode of goodness, because by following the rules and regulations, due to having some knowledge of Shastra, one does regulated sense enjoyment, all the karma kanda. And so one doesn't incur, deep and strong sinful reactions. And thus they have good karma credits, so relatively good existence, right? They're not suffering from the very sinful activities, the reactions from all the sinful activities, because they have some knowledge that I should avoid these bad activities. And so what do we see? is that one with this knowledge enjoys relative happiness because they have a good birth, they have nice wealth, good intelligence, nice beauty, all these things, right? So it leads to relative happiness compared to others. But the problem is because life is good relative to others, it's like living in the A-class jail cell versus the C-class jail cell. One doesn't think, is there a better place to get to? We become attached to this knowledge of how we have a better position than everybody else, become proud of it. And thus we make no effort to try to get out and see what is even beyond the modes. We're seeing, it's like the prisoner who says, I have the best jail cell in a prison house. Oh, great, I'm good. Not realizing that there's a whole life that exists beyond the prison. That is real life. That is like someone in a mode of goodness in the material world. Simply enjoying the best of a bad bargain. Whatever is available here. So this mode of goodness, it is binding. Because one feels very proud of being advanced in knowledge in society, being wise, learned, and thus comes respect. And so we're bound by the attachment to this knowledge and relative happiness. And we don't look to get anything else. And thus, this mode of goodness is binding to us. And again, why this person isn't in so much misery? Because they have knowledge of right from wrong. So they know what to avoid. And again, it's regulated sense enjoyment. So they know sinful activities. And they're smart enough to know I should avoid those. So it requires some knowledge, but not transcendental knowledge. So they know how to, enjoy sense enjoyment in a regulated manner. But it's still going to lead to birth and death, old age and disease. Right? So the conditioning, yes, it's lighter compared to mode of passion and ignorance, but it's still binding. Because one doesn't take the time to think about a better option, just like that prisoner, not looking to think what is real life outside the prison house. Okay? So what are some characteristics we'll see a little bit later, but just to review while we're talking mode of goodness, mode of goodness, people are very mild-mannered, humble and peaceful and equipoised and, cool-headed, relatively happy. There aren't, real anger or big transformations of heart by hatred or aggression. They seem pretty calm people. And so this is what we see. And again, they're attached to this knowledge they have and their relative happiness. And so they make no work to try to get out to an even higher platform. Now, mode of passion. The mode of passion is born of unlimited desires and longings, O son of Kunti. And because of this, the embodied living entity is bound to material fruit of actions. So here, we see, this rajagun, this mode of passion. It means intense attachment, absorption. It's like greed. Not greed for Krishna, like the Ragatmika Bhaktas of Vrindavan, who have such a greed to be with Krishna and serving Krishna, but rather greed for material pleasures. So we're attached to what we have, and we hanker for what we don't have. So it's two forms of attachment. This hankering and lamentation. This is what defines the mode of passion. One's constantly working to fulfill so many intense desires. And so why is it binding? Because the work, what is binding? First of all, it is the work, the activity. So the attachment and happiness was binding in mode of goodness. The activity of work is what's binding in mode of passion. Because we work so much to try to satisfy these unlimited desires with so much time and effort to try to acquire more and more, one doesn't have time to learn about how to get out of these modes. Right? We're trapped because of this intense desire. So no time for devotional service right now. And one works laboriously trying to satisfy these desires. And we know the problem with the mode of passion is as soon as you fulfill one desire, you want another one even more. It burns stronger and stronger and stronger. Trying to fulfill desires to kind of, quote unquote, get it out of our system. It's like pouring fuel on a fire and trying to put it out with fuel. It won't work. It just makes it rage stronger. And this is how the mode of passion works. Right? So the characteristics of someone in the mode of passion, high emotions, very volatile, kind of this spicy personalities, very intense and fast moving, always trying to acquire more and more and more, and so it wants to show off all the things they have, and put oneself in a position to be admired by others, showing off all one's facilities. That's in the mode of passion. And Prabhupada writes in the purport that the most prominent feature of the mode of passion is the attraction between man and woman. The sex desire. It is the illustration of this mode of passion. And Prabhupada writes that basically the whole of the world is moving through this mode of passion and ignorance. It's very, very powerful and strong. And the challenge of the mode of passion is that usually it degrades one to the mode of ignorance. We saw in chapter 3 that lust was born of passion. And we know what ends in lust. It is becoming degraded. It is the all-devouring enemy. Okay? So the problem, the challenge with the mode of passion is it often degrades one into ignorance. And that's why Prabhupada always says that most of society is full in the mode of passion and ignorance. Okay? Now the final guna, this tamoguna. O son of Bharata, know that the modes of darkness, born of ignorance, is the delusion of all embodied living entities. The result of this mode are madness, indolence, and sleep, which bind the conditioned soul. So this ignorance, it's a complete opposite of the other two modes. By knowledge, one in the mode of goodness knows right from wrong. But for one in the mode of ignorance, it's the exact opposite. What is good for you seems really bad, doing some sacrifice. To the one in the mode of ignorance, why would you do that? And what's bad for you, deep intoxications or doing some nonsense activities, that seems really good, even though in reality it's very bad. So one has the opposite understanding. Intoxication is good, charity work is bad. That's his mode of ignorance. And there are three causes of being bound. So again, in mode of goodness, it was the happiness and attachment to knowledge. In passion, it was work. So what binds one in the mode of ignorance? It is this madness, laziness, and sleep. Right? In madness, it's the opposite of mode of goodness. One is very peaceful. Here, one is constantly agitated. And it leads to laziness, complete opposite of passion. Right? In passion, one is working very hard. In mode of ignorance, one is doing nothing. And sleep, right? Passion, you have no time for sleep because you want to work. Mode of goodness focused on rising early, being very pious. But in the mode of ignorance, the definition of happiness of I can sleep 12, 13 hours. And what one accomplishes in such sleep? Nothing. So the characteristics of mode of ignorance, addicted to intoxicants, knowing they are bad for one, knowing they're killing you, knowing they are sinful, and creating so many reactions. But one remains addicted. That is, fully, squarely in the mode of ignorance. Heavy intoxication or light. Excessive sleep, sleeping in the morning and afternoons and staying up to all hours of the night. We'll see this later in the chapter. But these are all in the mode of ignorance. So one, again, is bound by laziness. There's no endeavor to get out, to do anything, to actually make a better situation for oneself. So that is the mode of ignorance. So now Krishna will just summarize. O son of Bharata, the mode of goodness conditions one to happiness. Passion conditions one to fruitive actions. And ignorance, covering one's knowledge, binds one to madness. So again, this is the summary. So modes of nature condition the living entity, regardless of the mode, and keeps them trapped within this material world. They are satisfied in different bodies brought out by the modes of material nature. And the point here is that each mode is trying to get some pleasure in a different way, based on the mode or the qualities that we have. So in the mode of goodness, one is attached to the relative happiness and this knowledge. Hey, I know how to make a better position for myself. In passion, one is fully enjoying their intense endeavor to try to acquire more. And in ignorance, pure laziness. But each person in their mode thinks, I have it best. Each person thinks, I know best. And they're convinced and thus remain trapped. So now we understand the modes. One can try to find a way to get beyond them. Because beyond the modes lies a life of eternal bliss and happiness, free from the cycles of birth and death, old age and disease. And one can attain their real happiness, just like a prisoner in a prison house. Their real happiness, the real life, is not finding the best situation within the prison house. It is getting out of prison and back to their real life. Similarly, the living entity encased within the body, the material body, that is not our real life. Our real life is to enjoy blissfully in our spiritual form, in loving devotional service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, our Supreme Father, in devotional service. So knowing how I'm trapped, bound, shackled by the three modes of nature, we can then make a plan to try to get out. And so this is the first 9 verses of this chapter, and we'll continue the remainder next week. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki. Any questions or comments? Yes, Lord. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much, Roji, for the kind words. Yes, and blessings. Yeah, so a couple of things. So Brahman is distinct from Brahmana, which is, one of the 4 divisions of society, or Lord Brahma, which is the empowered creator and the chief among all demigods. So though the words look similar, they're distinct terms. But now what further confuses things is that the term Brahman refers to different aspects of ultimately the Supreme Lord, right? Because everything ultimately is an energy of the Lord. And so the whole of material nature is an inferior energy of the Lord. The living entities are the superior energy of the Lord. And then, the spiritual sky and the spiritual universe and Krishna himself, of course, are all part of the superior energy. So ultimately, everything is Brahman because it's coming from Krishna. But there are different, we have Para-Brahman, which refers to the super soul. And we have Brahman referring to the material substance. So this material substance, think about, if you had, I'm trying to think of a term, a sort of a metaphor, but the material substance is all the ingredients of matter. All the elements, all the ingredients of matter. So if you're going to build a universe, you need matter. Just like if you're going to build a house, you need all kinds of, raw materials. Wood and concrete and nails and shingles and all of these things. You need all these materials, right? So that's the materials. But assembling the materials doesn't create the house. You still need the living force to go create the house. So similarly, you can assemble all the materials of the material world, the 24 elements. That's coming from Krishna. That's the Mahatattva, the sum of all material substance. But it won't create life until it's impregnated with living energy, living entities, right? So then the matter starts to move and create different things, and then the material nature, which is these modes of material nature, they are ultimately they're under the supervision of Krishna, as we saw in that picture of the three personalities who are moving the living entity like puppet strings. So the specific reference here of Brahman is all of the material elements, but that requires still some further adjustment from the Parabrahman, the super soul, in order for life to exist. So, is that okay? Hare Krishna, thank you. Any other comments or questions today? Okay, so with that, then next week we'll carry on with Mata, do you have a question? No? Okay. Hare Krishna. Correct. Yeah, it's a good question because, are we in denial of the modes or are we struggling to get out of them, right? And so, in initial, without any knowledge, one just doesn't know, right? And so they are in denial. And one is convinced that, if I'm in the mode of ignorance, that I'm on the best path. This is the best of life, right? And the one in passion is convinced they are. But as one begins to understand, why is it that I'm always suffering and why am I always struggling? One may acquire some knowledge that, there's this concept of action and reaction. Oh, really? Well, what actions create good reactions and what actions create bad reactions? Maybe I should start to avoid. So it's possible that through association, one can, progress from a lower mode to a higher mode. Because again, Krishna said, the mode of goodness is the purest of the three. So there is a hierarchy. It's not that all three are equally. They all bind, but one is, progressively better than the next. So it's possible, as we associate with different aspects of material nature, that our modes change. Just like one in the mode of goodness, if they become associating with somebody in the mode of passion, might develop those ideas and qualities and then begin to enjoy that life. And one in the mode of passion may associate with the mode of ignorance and start to acquire those qualities. And so one can change and move its modes. And that's part of the understanding here. Krishna is going to give very, concrete examples of the foods that are in the mode of passion and ignorance and goodness, the activities, the different natures. Why? So that we can try to change and elevate ourselves to at least the mode of goodness. One should at least come to the mode of goodness, because from there one can actually transcend beyond the modes. So that is the idea, but again, it comes to knowledge. So then it comes to, the last point you made, which is, okay, we may know that I'm bound by these modes. I know that I'm bound by them, that they're leading me to suffer. But I'm still not able to free myself from them, right? So that also happens. Right? So one may become, practicing Krishna consciousness, devotional service. Manmana bhava madbhakto, trying to be a devotee, trying to think of Krishna, chanting, going for, but still the allurements of the material nature, of the modes of nature are present. Right? So one must be very staunch to restrict one from these activities, at least from the mode of ignorance and passion. One must, at a bare minimum, staunchly avoid mode of ignorance, right? Why in initiation, as Prabhuji mentioned yesterday, one of the vows is to abstain from intoxication. Because it is in the mode of ignorance. It will be destructive to one's attempts to become free. Okay? Then we have no gambling and illicit sex. Right? And meat eating. All four of them are in the mode of ignorance and passion. Right? So the vows are meant to help one, withstand the influence of the modes of material nature. Because if we're not so ready to do it on our own volition, at least through the strength of making, some commitments, one can. Okay? So that's why these are so important and imperative. And one can live in denial of that, but the reality is reality, right? Like the one in the mode of ignorance can be in denial that they're on a dangerous path, but the fact is they're on a dangerous path. Okay? So one must own up to the modes of nature, recognize their influence on them, and surrender to the Supreme Lord, to the spiritual master, and become free from the modes. Because Krishna is going to give us the formula to become free later in this chapter. Through devotional service. At once one can transcend sagunan samitita. One can transcend the gunas by devotional service. So, is that okay, Madhuri?
Yes.
Hare Krishna. Hare.
Nice class.
Hare.
Could we understand the three mode of how the most of situation and combination of the mode and the result of action in the past to binding up according to them. So my question is related to liberation with respect to this mode. So if one is in the mode of ignorance, is there a way to get liberated from that mode? And we need to come to the passion, then the goodness, then the higher goodness, and then get liberated.
Yeah, so one must come from the lower modes to the highest mode first. That's step one. But coming to the mode of goodness is not liberation. Sometimes we confuse mode of goodness with devotional service. But it's not. Remember, mode of goodness is still within the material conception. So one from the mode of ignorance should start to, change their tastes, their activities. It's very practical. It's not just random. One must make a lifestyle adjustment. Coming to the mode of goodness. And then from the mode of goodness, one can become free from the modes by taking to spiritual life. Because spiritual life is fully focused on the spiritual relationship with Krishna and abandoning any relationship with matter. And so that's what, when we say liberation refers to becoming free from the modes of nature, free from the binds. It's not a geographic destination. Liberation doesn't mean that I'm going from point A to point B. It means being liberated from the influence of the three modes. So that occurs when one comes from wherever they might be to the mode of goodness, and from there transcending to the higher modes. And because in the mode of goodness, one is following Shastra, but the material karmakanda aspects of Shastra. Now one will begin, hopefully, to inquire, what is the ultimate purpose of Shastra? Not to enjoy my senses, but to enjoy with Krishna. That's how one progresses to the ultimate Shuddha Sattva, pure goodness.
It seems like we have little Puranas. The first Purana refers to the mode of goodness.
Hmm?
It means those Puranas are not giving the basics. They're just lifting the people consciousness to higher consciousness.
Yeah, it's progressive, right? Yeah. So and the reason is, if one is in the mode of ignorance, there's some place they can start and make progress, right? What's the point of second grade school? Is to get one to third grade, and third grade to fourth grade, and fifth grade, ultimately up to graduation. So Krishna is very kind, is creating a very expansive entry point. One can enter at any point. But again, one doesn't need to go to the progressive stages. To graduate school, you have to go through each step. But Krishna and devotional life says you can come straight to bhakti. But yes, the purpose of these different shastric sections is to keep one progressing, ultimately to knowing Krishna. And that's what Krishna is going to say in the next chapter. That Vedesha Savar Aham Eva Vedyo. Aham. Of all the Vedas, Aham, am to be known. So it's all a stepping stone to knowing Krishna. And when we know Krishna, the only conclusion is bhakti, rendered loving devotional service.
Prabhuji, I've got one question.
Yes.
My question is, you said in the beginning of the class that the mode of goodness is the daunting task for which we try to come out of it and go to the transcendental path. And we know that when one is trying to do bhakti or something, as Maharaj also mentioned, that is not on a material side, right? That's on a transcendental side. So, I'm trying to understand the ones who are beginning their journey in the Krishna consciousness, many of us, where we be trying to do some devotional service. But still we are bound by these modes in many of the things. Sometimes, mode of goodness don't look true sometimes, right? So I'm trying to understand, where does that category belong then? Not in the mode of goodness, not on the moral path, we're trying to still do devotional service. So where are you at?
Yeah, so the aspiring devotee, the sadhaka, where are we? Are we in the mode of goodness? Are we in the passion, ignorance? What it is we have come to the point of practicing devotional service with some conditioning, right? So we have some modes that are that we have been conditioned by. So in the practice of devotional service, we are working to shed that conditioning, to become free from whatever. Prabhupada was a perfect example. He brought people who were squarely in the mode of ignorance straight to devotional service, right? They were intoxicating, full on drugs and sex life and so many, degraded activities. And he, by the power of devotional service, brought them to the highest platform. Right? So, but doesn't mean as soon as I start bhakti, I'm pure, I'm free from all the modes. No, but I am in the process of becoming free from them. So and when you see in the process of shedding the modes, it takes time. But the sadhaka, the practicing devotee, they are trying to become fully situated in the Shuddha Sattva, pure goodness. But until one enters and becomes, a pure devotional service, the realm of pure devotional service, one will have some tinges of the modes of nature. So, we can say, yes, I'm still in the mode of goodness, or maybe I have some elements of mode of passion, hopefully at least no mode of ignorance. But those elements may be there. But I'm in the process of cleansing, shedding them, so I can come to the mode of pure goodness, which is for pure devotional service. So that's how we can understand. We can't necessarily put ourselves in an exacting category, but understanding, kind of our process of becoming free from the modes through the practice of devotional service. So, is that okay?
Yes, we're trying to free ourselves from that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hare Krishna. Hare. Okay. Any other follow-ups? Okay, well, if not, thank you very much. So next week we'll continue in chapter 14, the three modes of material nature. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki. Hare Krishna.